So no shit, there we were, sneaking across a war zone with a slowly awakening Tyranid psyker and a quickly dying space marine, when Sergeant Rebus called for his evac. If you actually needed proof that the entire purpose of the universe is to shit on poor hardworking guardsmen, it'd be damned hard to find something better than that timing right there. I mean, just to remind you, this wasn't some simple pickup from a combat zone he needed. No. He needed us to sneak back into boarding range of a Tyranid hive ship, which was still being assaulted by a few million orc fighters, to pick him up before the high-yield vortex bomb he'd just planted went off. You could say that we weren't the ones doing the actual sneaking, and that we'd been safely through it before, without the armed vortex bomb, of course. But this time, it would be a race against the zoanthrope waking up and Sergeant Gravis melting. Every man has their limit, and this was well beyond ours. Before the pilot could respond, Sarge put on Gravis's helmet and, calmly, clearly, told the Space Marine to wait his damned turn. All of us, except for Doc, who was rather busy, cheered. Sergeant Rebus and the pilot were less enthusiastic. The argument that followed included accusations of cowardice, the pilot coming out of the cockpit with a bolter and threatening to kill either us or the zoanthrope, and Sarge telling one of the Emperor's Angels of Death to shut up and soldier. In the end, a combination of devotion to the mission and desire to save his sergeant won the pilot to our side. Sergeant Rebus was instructed to delay the bomb's detonation and hold out until we were dropped off and a return trip could be made. The conversation ended with Rebus bitterly complaining that dying waiting for evac was an end worthy of a guardsman. Sarge responded by telling him that holding the line wasn't that hard. After all, us guardsmen did it all the time. Now, it might sound like we callously doomed a team of valiant space marines to their deaths, but we really weren't delaying their extraction that long. The Marines had prepared for this type of situation when they'd adjusted their mission plan to account for only having one shuttle. The Occurrence Boarder had followed our stealthy little vessel into the system as quietly as it could, and was now close enough that it'd be a matter of minutes, not hours, to reach it. Of course, being that close meant there was a significant risk of detection, and the Occurrence Boarder did not have any real way to hold off an attack by the orcs or the nids. Back at the briefing, Rebus had claimed it was an acceptable risk, though, which goes to show you what a bloody tactical genius he was. Okay, maybe that's a little unfair. Having the ship closer turned out to be very good for him, and it's not like he could have foreseen that we'd capture the zoanthrope, but forget to bring along that second dose of that special psych tranquilizer stuff. Though if he's spared the blame, then that means Gravis and his scout deserve a little for not taking the excessively simple precaution of leaving a few spare doses in the shuttle. I mean, we were going into extremely hostile territory. Why was the scout carrying all the tranks? And why hadn't either of them told us a second dose would be needed? Is Tyranid wrangling some super-secret Emperor's Scythes-only technique? Or did they think that there was no way that we'd survive and continue the mission if they didn't? Well, actually that one is completely understandable. Arrogant as hell, but understandable. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. The zoanthrope was a problem later. At the time, our big concern was that half of Gravis was dying and the other half was violently decomposing. Once again, the task was divided between Doc and Tink. This time, Doc was much calmer, and his response was surprisingly reasonable and professional. He fussed around the upside-down Space Marine torso with his medical scanner and tox wands, and shouted questions about Astartes biology and power armor automated Medicae systems at the pilot. There was some rather confusing talk about illicit kidneys, biomedical cogitators, and cellular regenerator reservoirs, which the rest of us ignored, because Tink's part of the job was a complete shit show. Whatever was on the Flyrant sword, when it got going, it really got going. Gravis's lower half went from fine to melting from the wound down in mere seconds. It's hard to say whether Tink's response was the best or worst one available, but it was certainly the most disgusting. In an effort to slow down the process, he unbuckled the power-armored legs and flipped them upside down. The smoldering bandage immediately gave way and dumped a horrible combination of meat juice, xenotoxins, and extremely powerful acid onto the seat. The smell was beyond vile, and all of us had to put on our rebreathers just to stay conscious, which was lucky considering how many airborne toxins were found in that shuttle when we landed. So after the spillage started dissolving the seat, the rest of us became very interested in helping Tink. Of course, none of us knew jack shit about biochemistry, so we were only able to offer what might be called mechanical solutions to the acid problem. And most of those suggestions were absolutely terrible. In the end, we settled on the traditional occurrence border technique of shoving it out the airlock, and hoping it needed oxygen and heat to keep doing whatever. So that's why, when we finally docked with the occurrence border, our shuttle hull was decorated by a pair of legs being gripped by Spot the Wonder Drone. It says something that none of the people waiting in the bay even commented on that. The occurrence border had been warned of the time-sensitive nature of our cargo, and the welcoming party was well prepared. Doc's hospitalier girlfriend and her minions were ready with a bunch of scary-looking medical gear, and sort of big goo-filled container. Gravis's legs and, to Tink's horror, Spot were immediately pried off the hull, crammed into said giant pickle jar, and hauled off before we'd even made it out of the shuttle. Doc was the first one down the ramp. With Tink's help, he deposited Gravis on a waiting gurney, then turned to his girlfriend and went for a hug and a quick kiss. He didn't get either. Instead, she screamed at him to keep his rebreather on, hosed him with a chemical sprayer, and then ordered him to go through a full decontamination and meet her in the medbay. Doc stood there and dripped for a second, and then dejectedly jogged after his departing girlfriend. Those of us who weren't struggling to get the zoanthrope out of the shuttle chuckled at this, at least until a pair of sprayer-armed minions started hosing us as well. We'd all been thoroughly soaked by the time we got the zoanthrope out of its seat and loaded onto the cargo trolley Hannah had waiting for us. The sprayers then moved on to hosing the shuttle's interior, but before they could get much done, the rear hatch slammed shut and the engines kicked back on. In clear violation of all safety procedures, the pilot rocketed out of the bay before we'd cleared the area. As he left, the pilot calmed us and promised vengeance if Gravis didn't survive. And from the helmet Sarge was still carrying, we overheard him giving his ETA to Sergeant Rebus. We silently wished him luck, then turned to the serious business of getting our zoanthropes stored in the psyker containment cells. The zoanthrope hadn't been any trouble during the unloading process. That was because it had come almost fully awake while we were still 10 minutes out, and we'd had to do something about it. Initially, we'd hoped that this far away from other Tyranids and the hive ship, it'd revert to being a dumb beast. Acting on this theory, when the zoanthrope started clawing at its straps and manifesting small bolts of electricity, Sarge attempted to establish superiority by punching it in the snout. That did not work. Plan B was to hit it with one of the guard-issue trank and painkiller sirets from Doc's kit. It's not like he was using them anyway. When that didn't work, we went with Plan C, which was to keep applying Plans A and B until they did work. After a fair amount of punching and enough tranks to kill 3 men, the uppity Xenos Psyker finally went back to sleep. Disturbingly, though, the shuttle was still filled with little snaps of static, and we all felt a sort of ominous pressure in the air. We tried to call the Xenologist Adept back on the ship and get his opinion on that, but our comms had a surprising amount of trouble, so we settled on asking him to meet us in the bay. The Adept was waiting next to Hannah, and as we loaded the Zoanthrope onto the pallet, he took note of the minor phenomena as well as the empty Surets that we'd left sticking in the Xenos. After processing this for a second, he began yelling at us to go faster, which was immensely unhelpful since we were all out running him until he got on the pallet himself. The part where he called ahead to warn the Psyker cells and ask Fumbles to meet us halfway was more useful though, so we forgave him. Picture, if you will, a cargo pallet racing down the corridors of a spaceship. It is occupied by a large unconscious Xenos that looks like a cross between a snake and a fetus, a slightly overweight man in robes, and a guardsman with an injured leg. The guardsman is holding a wrench that is connected to a random tangle of wires which has been hung over the Xenos. As the pallet races along, he is using the wrench to ground increasingly large bursts of inexplicably green electricity against the floor and walls. Behind the pallet are a terrified-looking tech priestess and a burly guardsman who looks like he'd recently crawled through a burning razor blade factory. Both of them are pushing the pallet as fast as they can through the maze-like series of corridors that make up the ship. Every twist and turn requires a frantic effort to change the heavy pallet's direction, and occasionally, one of the pushers will misjudge, slam into a wall or door frame, and then have to scramble to catch back up. A fair distance ahead of the pallet are 2 guardsmen. One is wiry and wreathed with explosives. The other is short and lugging a backpack near to bursting. They are screaming at people to get out of the corridors, applying indiscriminate force when necessary, and opening the various doors and hatches the pallet needs to go through. A little bit behind them is a guardswoman who could be defined as regal-looking if she wasn't completely filth-encrusted. She is pausing at corners and relaying upcoming direction changes to the pallet's pushers. So this parade of panic made its way through nearly half a kilometer of ship's corridors, trailing confusion and technical failures behind it. But it didn't really get bad until right at the halfway point, when Fumbles suddenly stepped out of a side hatch and into the path of the onrushing pallet. A second later, he was face down on top of the Zoanthrope, clutching his badly bruised shins and screaming at the top of his lungs. Not being a psyker, I can't really say what Fumbles did during that mad scramble. From our perspective, he just sort of laid there and gibbered. And later on, he claimed not to remember any of it. He was probably doing something really important, like keeping the Zoanthrope from doing stuff while it was unconscious, or hiding us from the hive mind. Chances are that without him doing his thing, we would have died horribly before we got to the holding cells. We didn't really appreciate that at the time, though. All we noticed was how immensely inconvenient Fumbles made the rest of the journey. After Fumbles arrived, in addition to the electricity thrown off by the sleeping Zoanthrope, we had to deal with freak indoor snowstorms, a few instances of spontaneous gravity reversal, and all sorts of creepy noises and visions. On 2 occasions, the effects were so bad that Sarge considered dumping the accident-prone Psyker off the pallet and leaving him behind. but the xenologist adept insisted that he stay. Luckily, Hannah's augmetics didn't take that long to start working again after they spontaneously locked up, and the minor demon only made it 3 steps before a combination of pulse fire and what might be called a power wrench turned it into chunky salsa. Despite all the complications, we made incredibly good time on our mad sprint, covering something like a kilometer in just under 6 minutes. That wasn't quite fast enough, though. We'd reached the final stretch and could see Jim holding the door open, when the ominous sort of psychic pressure we'd been feeling suddenly ratcheted up. As the pressure mounted, Fumbles gibbered something like, "It sees, it knows, it hungers," and the entire corridor filled with a torrential downpour of blood. Everything slowed to a crawl as the first drop of blood hit Sarge's face. Memories of 2 psychers in a cargo bay flitted through his mind, and he slowly began to reach towards Fumbles. Then everything exploded. There were actually 2 explosions. The first was a sort of psychic concussion. For a second, the rain of blood paused in midair. Then there was a crack of energy, and a wave of force radiated out from Fumbles. It was strongest at its epicenter, and all 3 of the pallet's human passengers were thrown off. Tink and the Adept both slammed into the corridor's walls while Fumbles flew upwards. Inexplicably struck to the ceiling for a second. Then flopped to the floor with an unpleasant splash. Behind the pallet, Sarge saw the wave coming and rather gallantly pushed Hannah behind him. This did not have the intended result. The wave hit Sarge, and over 100 kilos of psychically propelled non-com slammed into Hannah. This in turn resulted in both of them tumbling backwards and landing in a heap, unfortunately with Sarge on top, nearly crushing the poor cog girl. He probably would have died of embarrassment if it weren't for the fact that all 5 human projectiles were left unconscious by the blast. The final effect of the psychic concussion was to blow out all the lights in the corridor. Twitch, Nubby, and Amy activated their shoulder-mounted lights and watched through the rain of blood as the pallet sloshed to a halt. The 3 of them held position and kept their weapons trained on the zoanthrope until Jim shouted Hannah's name and began to run past them. Nubby casually stuck out a foot and tripped the panicked cogboy, then followed Amy and Twitch as they began to move towards the pallet. Their cautious advance had nearly reached the pallet when the zoanthrope suddenly jerked into the air. It hung there for a second, like some sort of horrible giant puppet being held up by tangled strings. Then a second explosion shook the entire ship, the world went green, and Amy started screaming. It was a bit of a surprise to find ourselves alive after that. Nubby and Twitch stood there in the ankle-deep blood, shielding their eyes against the bright green light and watching Amy, who was screaming and wildly firing her pulse rifle at the zoanthrope's glowing energy shield. Guardsmen that they were, both of them quickly raised their own weapons and started firing as well, but after a few seconds they noticed that something was weird. The zoanthrope wasn't fighting back. There were no lightning bolts or soul-rending screeches, and on closer inspection it didn't even appear to be awake. Of course, it wasn't until Theo came out of where he'd been hiding in the cells, helped Jim to his feet, and asked whether the plan was still to capture the zoanthrope alive, that they considered not shooting the Xenos. Everyone except Amy, who was too busy hysterically shooting at the zoanthrope to talk, put their heads together to figure out what to do. While the zoanthrope may not have been attacking, the psychic pressure had gone from ominous to outright painful, so the debate was a very short one. The second halfway reasonable suggestion was put forward, they all leapt into action, though Twitch and Nubby both bitterly complained that it was the non-human who made the plan. Well, plan is a grandiose term. They wanted to get the zoanthrope into the cells, but no one wanted to touch the sparking green shield. So Theo had made the stereotypically Tau suggestion of using drones. He had Jim send a small swarm of servo skulls and kludged together Tau drones behind the zoanthrope, and had them start ramming its shield in an attempt to herd it towards the door. Nubby and Twitch contributed by getting Amy to stop shooting and make sure no one was drowning in the warp blood. The plan was decent, but had a major problem. It was too slow. The skulls and drones didn't have that much pushing power to begin with, and the electrical nature of the zoanthrope's shield was frying them one by one. It was a race against the psychic pressure mounting to lethal levels, and we were losing. None of us had any other ideas, though, and things probably would have gone poorly if Amy hadn't snapped out of her PTSD-inspired violent freakout. When Amy returned to coherence, she took one look at how slow it was going, cussed everyone else out for being useless sissies, and seized the forgotten cargo pallet. She ran towards the zoanthrope, building up as much speed as the blood allowed, and at the last second levered the pallet onto two wheels and used it as a sort of poorly balanced battering ram. It worked surprisingly well. With Nubby and Twitch's help, another 2 blows got the zoanthrope to the door of the psyker containment cells, where the problem of how to fit a 3-meter energy bubble through a 2-meter wide door presented itself. This was solved by the arrival of Sergeant Tink, who'd finally finished their naps and decided it was time to be actually useful. While Jim and Theo, who weren't quite as stubborn as us guardsmen, argued over whether it was possible to widen the door without damaging something or other, we backed to the end of the corridor. We picked the pallet up like a more traditional battering ram, Sarge positioned himself at the end, and then we charged. Jim and Theo's debate was brought to a halt as a wildly sparking Xenopsyker shot between them, bounced off a few pieces of delicate machinery, and neatly slid into the waiting stasis unit. The techies slapped various on buttons, and then the terrible psychic pressure vanished. Out in the corridor, those of us who hadn't broken anything cheered, but our enthusiasm dwindled as every comm terminal in the cells began ringing.